I'm here at the offices of the Evening Standard to speak with the editor, George Osborne, former MP, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, an honorary professor of economics at the University of Manchester, the fellow of the McCain Institute, the Hoover Institute, the Stanford Business School, as well as the chair of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. Also a dad of two and an opera enthusiast. But we'll have a bit more about that later. Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the Evening Standard.
Well, thank you very much. Now, you were quite famously not born George Osborne. You were born Gideon Osborne, but you changed your name at 13. That's quite a big decision to make at quite a young age.
Well, do you know, I just never liked my first name. Obviously, I didn't get to choose it. My parents did. And I remember I used to complain about it all the time as a child. And in the end, my mother just said, look, stop whinging about it and change it. And I picked George because I had a grandfather called George, not that I'd met him. I think because it began with G, so it wasn't such a big change from Gideon. And what was amazing is how quickly everyone at school just switched over to George. I mean, no one now calls me Gideon. There's an ex-girlfriend who occasionally does, but that's just to wind me up.
Out of affection or because, you know, she's never quite gotten over it?
I think just to annoy me.
Fair enough. And now your dad is the Osborne of Osborne and Little, the fabric and wallpaper designers. And it's been said that your house growing up was like a cultural version of the Miliband house. So instead of sort of philosophers and sort of economists, it was writers and designers. I mean, what was that like? Well,
it was a very comfortable upbringing. Right here, we're here in Kensington. You know, we're literally, this building is by the bus stop that I used to take. I used to wait for my bus to go to my school at the end of Kensington High Street. And my father is an interior designer. And it was a very happy upbringing of, you know, full of kind of culture and trips to art galleries at the weekend and trips to the theatre and restaurants. I mean, it was a kind of comfortable cosmopolitan upbringing, not political. I mean, we talked about politics a lot, and my mother had worked for Amnesty International, but you know, I'd never met an MP. The only MP I ever came across was like the people who occasionally came to speak at our school and whatever. It wasn't a kind of childhood of politics. It was a childhood of, I guess, kind of cultural, you know, upper middle class London.
Mm-hmm. And people, they like to get a sense of their politicians, and I'm not sure that folk out there ever really felt that they got a handle on you. What kind of kid were you? So you were going to sort of museums and art galleries and stuff at the weekend. So were you more bookish than sporty, or were you more into girls than music, or you know, what kind of kid were you?
I used to run a mile from sport, and girls used to run a mile from me. So it was quite a kind of swotty, you know, childhood. I mean, I worked hard at school. You know, I was like the deputy head boy, and I was in the debating club. I mean, there was nothing, you know, there was nothing particularly cool about it. My big kind of moment actually was after I left school. I mean, my school did a very good job for me, but I didn't feel very emotional about it. And I had one of those years off, you know, very middle class between school and going to university. And I traveled and I crossed through Africa and I went to college in America for a bit. And that was when I completely reinvented myself. I basically says like, I'm actually, you know, I've done my exams. I got into my university. Now I'm going to go and have some fun. And I grew my hair long and I started having lots of girlfriends, and suddenly I was having a good time. And it was it kind of turned on a dime. I remember my parents coming out to see me in North Carolina, where I was sort of temporarily at college, and they barely recognized this hipster who picked them up at the airport in Charlotte, North Carolina.
And before you got to North Carolina, you said you went through Africa. Is it true that you and a mate pretended to be from the England under-21 football team in order to get better treatment at the airport?
We pretended all sorts of things. No, we pretended to work for newspapers to get nice rooms in hotels. We crossed the Sahara Desert. I mean, it was an amazing trip with hindsight. And you couldn't do it now because actually the areas we went through are now very dangerous. But we went all the way through the Sahara, through Algeria and Niger. I mean, it was an amazing time. And, you know, it's for a young person set up in life because they're going to college, as I say, you know, lucky with their background. It was a real journey for me of discovery about myself, and I loved it, actually.
Well, your son is probably approaching your age.
He's on a year off at the moment, and
would you let him go and do something that wild?
He's working for he's working for a record label at the moment. He's a lot cooler than I was. My first job was working in Foyle's bookshop in Charing Cross Road in London. I would let him. My father was very unprescriptive. His dad, who I'd never met, George Osborne. My
War
grandfather.
hero?
He was a proper soldier, career. So he won a military cross in the First World War. It's unusual for someone my age that their grandfather was in the First World War, not the Second World War. But, he allowed my father, or rather his family allowed my father, because he died, to go and be an interior designer, which was, opposite of being a soldier, really. And my father was, they've got this wonderful business he's built up. He's never put any pressure on me or my brothers to go into that business. And sometimes it's my mother who says, it's a shame none of you want to take the business on. And my father said, look, I went and did what I wanted to do, and we should let our children go and do what they want to do. So I think they were a bit surprised when I turned up as a Tory MP, but we'll go on to that.
Well, what I then find hard is so you're quite a swattish kind of head of the debate team at school. You then had this mad eye-opening year, rocked up at University at Oxford with the curly hair, having reinvented yourself as a cool kind of hipster, I think was the word that you used. What would then attract you? What would attract anyone to something like the Bullingdon Club with its tie and tails and all boys and bad, obnoxious, horrible behaviour?
I think it's because I wanted to experience everything at university. Yes, the Bullingdon Club, which of course everyone quite rightly probably thinks is pretty awful, but it was only literally a couple of days out of my entire university time. I was editor of the university magazine with the unfortunate name of ISIS. I'm always waiting to be stopped at US Customs. Hold on, you were associated with ISIS. But that was a great student magazine. I mixed with a whole bunch of different people. The thing actually I was really put off was student politics. I turned up and I thought, I'll get involved in the debating union. And I was really, it was a big turn-off. And interestingly enough, with what happened later in my life, a lot of the people who were involved in the kind of student politics at the time on the Conservative side, although I wasn't at that point a Conservative, were the people who later led Brexit. It was like Dan Hannan, Mark Reckless. I mean, I'm not, they were actually friends of mine. But I just thought...
And that bit older, Michael Gove was a big debater at
They
uni as well.
had left that generation, but Dan Hannan, I remember meeting in this is the Conservative MEP who, is probably about the most influential Brexiteer of all, was someone I met. And I remember them all debating, should we be signing up to the Maastricht Treaty? And it all seemed pretty remote to me at the time.
Looking back, do you ever wonder what you were doing with some of it?
Sorry?
Well, what you were doing, you said you wanted to try a bit of everything, but I mean, you had to stand up as Chancellor of the Exchequer, tell people that you were instituting austerity, that we were all in it together, and the daily newspapers were putting pictures of you as a 21-year-old lad wearing an £1,000 tailcoat when you were a student.
Borrowed.
And most students are on beans and toast.
No, I have never pretended that I know or experienced what it's like to have a kind of tough upbringing, or to not worry, to worry about where the money is coming from. And I never tried to kind of use my life story to be anything other than to say, I am who I am. I'm very lucky to have come from the background I've come from. My parents, are still happily married. My father set up his own business. My mother ran her own business, food shop. And, I just want for as many people what I had. And if I can provide that in some way as a politician, that's all well and good. But, there is absolutely no hard luck story. And I can't pretend there ever was.
So let's catch up with where we are. So we've covered kind of school and then mad year out, which I think probably is a whole interview by itself by the sounds of things. University, at the point at which you left university, having been the editor of the newspaper, it was journalism you wanted to go into. So I guess the question is, how did you end up as a researcher for the Tory party? And especially if you weren't actually a Tory.
Well, I applied for various newspaper jobs. They were kind of graduate schemes at the time, although it was in a recession when I left. And so there weren't that many jobs going, and the ones I applied for I didn't get. And so, probably a bit unreasonably, I started to sort of panic towards the end of the year I'd left, the calendar year I'd left university. I thought, what am I going to do? And there was a friend of mine called George Bridges, who was working for the Tories at Central Office. And I had voted Conservative in the election that had happened in 1992 as just an ordinary voter. I wasn't a member of the Conservative Party. And I guess that made me think, I guess I did vote Conservative in an election where lots of people had, voted Labour and people thought Labour were going to win. And he was leaving to go and work in Downing Street, leaving the Tory HQ. And he said, why don't you apply for the job that I'm leaving? And so I did, not with a huge, I'd love to think there was some like massive life plan. And to be fair, people who were at school with me or at university were never particularly surprised with the career I had. But for me at the time, living it seemed like an unusual move, or certainly something I hadn't, greatly thought through. But I turned up at the Tory HQ and suddenly aged, 22, 23, you're there in the heart of power and going to Downing Street and meeting all these people who otherwise you would see on the television and talking about, I've always been really interested in sort of the issues of, how societies are run, what the big stories of the day are. At home with my mother, we would often talk about what was going on internationally. She was passionate about, and still is, about various causes. And so, suddenly being in that world in the early 1990s was great. I had a boss called Rachel Whetstone. She'd just taken over from David Cameron, who had previously been running that bit of the kind of Tory operation. And she's now a great star in Silicon Valley. And it was a really bright bunch of people. And people, it's interesting, later when we became the Notting Hill set and we were accused of being too cliquey in government, it wasn't that we'd all gone to school together or gone to university together. We actually were different ages and hadn't really met each other until we all started working for the Conservatives in the early 90s. And that's where those bonds and friendships were formed.
And you say it was a really bright bunch of people. You go in at 23, not the most convicted to the cause, I guess probably fair to say, because there's some people that have wanted to do this their whole life. You're surrounded by other bright people, but you're the party's youngest MP by 30, and you're the Shadow Chancellor by 33. That's quite the rise.
Well, the backdrop to all this was, of course, the Conservatives were doing terribly. So I definitely bought in at the bottom of the market. When I went to work for the Conservatives in the 1990s, it didn't seem so strange to me. I thought it was interesting. And of course, once I was there, I could see that this was an incredibly interesting way to spend my life. Most people at the time were much more excited, most my age, were much more excited by New Labour and Tony Blair and, the New Labour opposition and then the New Labour victory in 1997, which I remember very vividly. And so what that did to the Conservative Party at the time was it essentially destroyed several generations of Conservative politicians above me. There were, before I became the Shadow Chancellor, there had been 6 previous Shadow Chancellors to Gordon Brown. He'd been Chancellor Exchequer for years and years and years, and I was the 7th Shadow Chancellor. And there had been Michael Howard and Michael Portillo and Oliver Letwin and Peter Lilly and all these, Ken Clark. There'd been a whole series of people who'd been Shadow Chancellor. And here was this, I was like the last person standing. I was this 33-year-old who'd got elected. And to be fair, Michael Howard, who was the Conservative leader at the time, I think took a big bet that the Tory party needed to skip a generation, and me and David Cameron and others were that new generation.
And before we get to there, so you mentioned that New Labour victory of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. You used to help William Hague prep for PMQs, Prime Minister's Questions, against Tony Blair when you were still a researcher, and you used to play Tony Blair in the scenarios. He's got a very distinct way of speaking. Can you still mimic him?
Well, a bit, I guess. Before I get to that point, so I have 2 very strong memories. One, which came later back to sort of remind me about politics, and there was an echo of what later happened to me. I used to go to see John Major when he was Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street and tell him about the press every morning at about 6 in the morning. And I'd go into his flat, a flat I later lived in with my family. And I remember the last day of the 97 general election, it'd been a nice sort of chintzy flat at the top of 10 Downing Street. And I walked in and it was all packed up, empty in boxes. And I thought, my God, power is about to, and the Prime Minister, until that point, had been the centre of everything. And then suddenly you realise it's gone. And on the day of the 97 election, I'd been working in Downing Street. And I went and watched it on television, Tony Blair arriving, and it's difficult to remember now with everything that's happened, but that kind of sense of euphoria in the country. I was sort of excited, even though I was a Conservative and just lost my job. Not particularly excited for Tony, but just excited at these big political events happening around me. And again, then when I then worked for William Hague as who I backed to be the Tory leader, he was the young outsider, and then went to work as one of his right-hand people, it just felt like a kind of exciting period because almost all my life there had been a Conservative government and it had fallen, and now there was a Labour government and we were trying to rebuild the Tory party from the ashes.
And do you think that it mattered when you and David Cameron were trying to build a Tory government after there was sort of three leaders who never managed to sort of climb that summit, that you had been there right at the beginning, that you'd been at the wipeout and you could see, how to build things up with worn-out tools, if you want to put Kipling's sort of word on it? I was almost the only person, if not maybe the only person, who worked every single sort of day of that Tory opposition for the Conservatives. And I was the first person into the opposition bloc after Labour had vacated it. I remember John Major, who briefly was leader of the opposition after Tony Blair had won, sitting me down, and I was, this was the Prime Minister, and I was still in my mid-20s, saying to me, don't let William be destroyed by the right. Don't let Europe destroy him. Watch out for the, Eurosceptics. All very prophetic for what was later to happen to my whole career. But it was a kind of, I think because I saw those false starts, William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, Michael Howard, all trying to get the Tory party back in the game, but fundamentally not, confronting the fact that the Tory party was deeply out of tune with the country on a whole set of issues, from everything from gay rights to the role of women in public life and in the workforce. The Tory party was just way out of date. And the only time I rebelled, jumping forward, but when I became a young MP, we were told as young Tory MPs we had to vote against the law that was going to allow gay people to adopt. This was like a 3-line whip. Ian Duncan Smith was the leader at the time. And I remember just saying, I am not going to vote against gay adoption. And I looked around and everyone else in the party was voting for this. I was like, maybe I'm a bit alone here. And I discovered there were 2 other rebels in my kind of intake, and that was David Cameron and Boris Johnson. And the 3 of us kind of hid in a corner while this vote happened. And obviously the Tories quite rightly lost and gay adoption went ahead. But I just felt strongly that the Conservative Party was not talking to my generation. It had completely lost touch with the kind of middle-class, metropolitan, urban environment I'd grown up in, and was self-evidently not offering very much to the rest of the country either. So, I use my own personal experience. I was saying, if people from where I come from, my background, aren't finding the Conservative Party attractive, who the hell is, In terms of talking about those 3 young bucks that were the 3 people that stood out with their more socially liberal, more metropolitan views, this next generation of Conservatives looking to allow gay people to adopt. It was you, it was David Cameron, and it was Boris Johnson. I mean, how do you square the Boris Johnson that you remember then with the hard Brexit, Dom Cummings, Boris Johnson now?
One of the good things about my life is, and one of the exciting things is, I've known Boris Johnson for 25 years, and he is enormously entertaining and engaging, and also a contradiction. He's a very talented, in many ways, sort of brilliant political operator. But often he'll adopt causes to get himself to the top that I don't agree with, including Brexit. And I always think when I look at Boris, I think he's got what it takes to be the Prime Minister. And he's sort of clearly fills the job. But there's part of it, I kind of wish he was the the half of the Dr. Jekyll side of Boris Johnson, which is the liberal, tolerant, pro-immigration, centrist Tory who was so successful in the city, London, and not the Mr. Hyde who's, divide the country, push Brexit to its kind of political limits in order to eke out the advantage amongst the Brexiteers. And I think he would be much better served as being the Boris Johnson who was the very successful mayor. And there are glimpses of it, interestingly. You do see it, and it's... So I think he's still got it in him to be a very successful prime minister. If he resists, he's made it now. He's at the top. And sometimes prime ministers need to remember they've made it. And when they've made it, they don't need to go on dividing the country because they're actually they've got the advantage of being the uniter of the country, the leader of the country. And that's what he should be. He should be the prime minister for the 17 million people who voted for Brexit, but also the 16 million people who voted for Remain. And I think his basic political instincts, beneath all the layers of calculation, are the right ones. And that's why I backed him to be the leader, much to lots of people's surprise. But I think he's got the material there, and he needs to resist some of the baser temptations. But
the story you've just told is, and I'm paraphrasing, but it came across very much as somebody who likes him, who's known him a long time, but who fundamentally agrees with the criticism that he doesn't believe in anything.
Well, I think Boris Johnson believes in Boris Johnson. That's not necessarily a bad thing in politics. Some of our greatest prime ministers, Winston Churchill, who Boris likes to compare himself to, and Benjamin Disraeli, who founded, in many ways, the modern Tory party. I mean, it's not clear they believed in much other than Winston Churchill and Benjamin Disraeli. So you can be a great leader of the country with just an enormous amount of self-confidence. You are the person, whatever the issue. But look, on Brexit, I basically take the view that David Cameron took, which is in his memoirs, which was that Boris saw it as a vehicle for advancing himself in the Tory party. He didn't think that the referendum would turn out the way it did. And he was perhaps as surprised as anyone by the results. It's interesting now in the reality of number 10. Remember all the bravado of we're leaving with no deal, we don't need these people. The reality of the job, and I've not done the job, but I've lived next door, which is you end up having to be very dependent on your European partners for your economy, for your security, for your voice in the world. I think Boris Johnson's, if he didn't know it already, discovering all that as Prime Minister. And so in practice, the Brexit he's proposing and the Brexit we might end up with, if there is going to be Brexit, will be pretty closely aligned to Europe. And I think if you end up in 50 years' time, you might wonder what all this fuss was about. You might say that Britain was never going to be part of the really core European project in the euro and so on. We were always going to be fellow travellers with Europe, and that's what we remain.
So what I don't understand then, taking you a little bit further forward from there, is you were the last person in at number 10 when the boxes had been packed for John Major. You were the person that John Major had sat down and said, you've got to be a Praetorian Guard for William Hague. You were the first person into the opposition blocs. You were the only person that had been there right the way through opposition to government. Why make way for David Cameron? You were the shadow chancellor. You were the sort of more experienced chap. He'd been, shadow education secretary for 5 minutes? You'd been in shadow cabinet for a good year, 2 years more than him. Why say, there you go, well, you take the ball?
We got to know each other. We didn't know each other before, particularly, and we haven't been at university or, he went to different schools to me, and he's 5 years older than me. We really got to know each other as MPs, become really good friends, and used to go to and from home together. I used to drive him, and then I said, I've got to try and get fit, one of my many efforts in life to get fit. And I started cycling, and so he started cycling with me because he lost his lift to the Commons, and we formed not just a kind of personal friendship bond, but an intellectual bond. We were like trying out ideas how the Conservative Party was going to get back into office. So then, when a vacancy came for the leadership, I was the shadow chancellor, he was the shadow education secretary. We'd just very recently been appointed, and he was so kind of clearly set that he wanted to do it. He had a really clear idea about how he wanted to run to be the leader. We didn't agree there and then to do any kind of deal. He said to me, look, you make your own decision about whether you want to run to be the leader. But if you don't want to run, I'd love you to run my campaign. And I kind of knew there and then, although I thought about it for a few more hours, that I am not in the same place he is. He is absolutely set on this course, whereas I'm very far from that. And I would love to try and help him win. So it wasn't a very difficult decision for me. And, so I certainly think it was the right decision.
And do you think you two were very young for that? You did have 5 years of opposition, granted. But, I mean, even in terms of Commons performances, time there, I mean, the House of Commons is a bear pit. It's so close. I don't think what people outside understand is that you've got a wall of people in front of you, a wall of people behind you. They go right up to the rafters. So there is no way that if you have a bad day or a misstep that you can escape scrutiny. It is one of the most unforgiving chambers, I think, anywhere in the world. And you're number 7 Shadow Chancellor off the lot to get beaten about the head by the clunking fist of Gordon Brown. I mean, did you think that the two of you had it in you to not only take on this lot, beat this lot, and then run the country?
I remember the first time I stood up as Shadow Chancellor, 33 years old, with a very sceptical Conservative parliamentary party behind me. And I was facing Gordon Brown. And I wanted to find some way to kind of break the ice. And I congratulated Gordon Brown on just being re-elected, because it was after the general election of 2005, for the constituency of Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath. And I said that, and this Labour MP said, "It's Kirkcaldy, you southern twat." And that was the end of my performance. The whole House of Commons descended into laughter. And I was like, oh my God. If you really felt like you're out there on no man's land and everyone's screaming and shouting, and the noise, it is very difficult for anyone who hasn't done it to understand what it is like when you're standing there in the House of Commons and literally 5 or 6 feet away from you, there are 300 people shouting at you. So you got to imagine a situation where you're standing somewhere and there's a whole crowd just screaming at you. And it's not like anything else you ever do, because most other speeches you give, the audience actually turns up because they want to hear you. Here, the audience wants you to fail.
Yeah, as someone that grew up 12 miles from Kirkcaldy, that is unforgivable, and you should never have been allowed back in there again. But like,
it was very good. I think I don't mean this, because I don't mean this as in any way to kind of criticise the current generation of Conservatives, because they had no choice and they've got massive experience in government, many of them, before they get where they are, like Sajid, the new Chancellor, or Dominic Raab as Foreign Secretary, whatever. But the years in opposition were very, very good training for having to be essentially a self-starter. If you get up every day, if you're the Shadow Chancellor, there's no treasury, there's nothing. There's just you and the little team you've gone and picked. And you've got to make the weather every day. And you've got to, and you're in a chamber with, a huge Labour majority, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair at the top of their game. I thought the 5 years I did as Shadow Chancellor, which I think is pretty much the longest in history that anyone's done that job, although I guess John McDonnell might be about to break the record, was really, really, really good preparation for the real job. And there is something about the British system which is opposition prepares you for government. And I felt, interestingly, going into Downing Street later as Chancellor, much more relaxed and calm than I'd been as the first Shadow Chancellor standing up against Gordon Brown. Much more prepared for the job than I was when I was 33.
But there was an enormous progression between standing up in 2005 and becoming Chancellor in 2010, because the message when you and David Cameron started out was hug a hoodie, hug a husky, big society, invest the proceeds of growth, let's match Labour spending plans. A financial crash happened in the middle, and by the time 2010 hits, it's austerity. So how do you make that pivot from what your mission and in going into the Treasury would be?
Well, the truth is the real world intruded on our plan. And I think we were better at adapting to that change in the political weather, dramatic change, than, frankly, our opponents in the Labour government were. there was an enormous financial crash. I think even now, 10 years on, we don't appreciate that this was as big almost as the Great Depression. They'll be writing about this in hundreds of years' time. It's not just like another recession or downturn in the economy. This was a dramatic shock that still reverberates around the world, led to, in my view, Trump in America, led to arguably to Brexit. It certainly led to the, Arab Spring. All sorts of events were prompted by this enormous dislocation in the world economy. And with it, the sense that the system was not delivering for people, it was very unfair, that the bankers weren't jailed, that the poor people paid for it. All of that stems from that event in 2008-9. And, frankly, a good plan that had existed before then to present the Conservatives as modern and compassionate and, generous with public spending and, environmentally green and all, just, I'm afraid, disintegrated when confronted with the fact, the country had run out of money, the economy was on its knees, and whoever was going to get elected in the 2010 election was going to have to make some very difficult, very unpopular decisions. And I remember the pressure on Gordon Brown as the Prime Minister at the time to admit there were going to be cuts, and he didn't want to do so. And Alistair Darling, my opposite number, who was Chancellor, saying there are going to be deeper cuts than Margaret Thatcher ever had. And he was planning increases in VAT and all the things that we ended up actually having to do. I think because we engaged with reality, we earned a lot of public acceptance for what we then had to do to get the country into shape. And you never had the feeling that people have been misled, that the Tories had spun you a lie, that we didn't have a mandate for what we were going to do.
Let me pick you up on that, because you've just talked about this enormous worldwide dislocation, this butterfly flap of wings that caused all of these things that rippled around the world. But at the time, you, as the architect of the campaign in 2010, tried to pin that squarely on Labour. It was Labour's big recession. They didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. You put a poster of a baby's face saying that he was going to inherit Gordon Brown's debt. So to put this enormous cataclysmic global event and pin it on one political party, looking back, do you not think that was a bit dishonest?
I think we were right to say that Britain had been particularly ill prepared for it. Given that we had been a rich and successful country, how did we end up with a deeper crash than anyone else, more debt than anyone else? The deficit, which came to be the kind of big issue when I was Chancellor, on the day I became Chancellor, was the third highest in the whole world. And the other countries were like Zimbabwe and somewhere else. We were in a much worse position than Germany or France or Italy or even the United States. And I thought the argument linking the kind of global crash to Britain's failure to, the point about fixing the roof when the sun was shining was precisely not that you were in charge of the weather, but you were in charge of your roof and how prepared you were for global events. So we didn't pretend that the banking crisis was not international, because it was self-evidently the case with Lehman Brothers and whatever. But the Gordon Brown, who was at the time the Prime Minister, had not prepared the country and was not levelling with the country about it either. And I think we were on to the spending and the debt and the what came to be called austerity because we knew it was a real issue, that you couldn't duck it. And in every country in the Western world, they had to confront these choices. And people know they had to confront them in Britain. And I think we earned a lot of credit in the bank, which we then had to spend, if you like, for being honest with people before a general election. I mean, how many people go into a general election saying, look, you elect us, we're going to freeze your pay, we're going to raise your retirement age, you're going to have to pay more tax. That's what we said going into the 2010 election. And there's still a theory that it cost us the majority. That's why we fell short and had to go into a coalition. But I would much rather have been the Chancellor saying, look, I told you about all this beforehand. I've not soft-sold this to you. Well, than pretending that, it was all going to be fine and, hunky-dory when it was clearly not going to be.
We'll get to the coalition in just a second. Looking back, David Cameron has said that actually he should have been braver and you should have been braver and you should have cut faster and deeper in the way that countries like Ireland did. Is that an analysis you agree with?
I think it's true that we never really got that time again at the beginning. When you got elected and you got the kind of political space, what people call a honeymoon, to do things. And when you look at other countries, as it turned out, they had much deeper cuts than we did more quickly. And there is an argument, that David makes in his book that we could have done it more quickly. I'm not sure. I think realistically we did it as fast as we could. And it wasn't, I believe, because we were upfront about it all and we had a plan and we called it Plan A and, people, it actually meant we didn't do as many cuts as most other countries. I know that sounds, if you look back, we oversold the cuts in order to reassure the world and the world economy and global markets that we had a plan, and underdid the actual reductions compared to almost every other Western country. I mean, America, it's interesting. America cut more deeply than we did, even though Barack Obama at the time his message was all fiscal stimulus, and our message was all austerity. So I think that was the right way around. We were trying to oversell the plan so that we didn't actually have to be as tough as we were making out.
Well, let's look at the kind of personalities, because you're seen as the architect of austerity still, whereas at the time, certainly, David Cameron was still being Mr. kind of let the sunshine in. Was it a planned good cop, bad cop routine? Because I'm not going to lie, you seem to relish it.
I was, I think if I look back, at the age of 38, my main preoccupation in terms of the way I was seen by the public was they've got to think this kid can do the job, right? There are two types. I had a theory about politics. It's like kill or be killed. If you look at a newspaper cartoon, we're here in the offices of the Evening Standard, a very good cartoonist, you're either like the little Bambi that's about to get eaten, or you're the tigers doing the eating. And I was worried that I was such a young Chancellor Exchequer, essentially very green, in terms of experience, and people would say, this guy is not up to it. I'm not trusting him with my money.
So it was imposter syndrome that you're trying to cover up for?
No. So the main message I wanted to project in 2010, 11, and so on was, I know what I'm doing. I'm completely in charge. I've got a plan. I can look after your money, and we're going to make things better for you. But it's going to be tough. And that came across, I think, as quite a sort of hard man look and quite a sort of brittle, And it was only much later as Chancellor that I felt kind of relaxed that I could take my tie off and wear casual clothes and be a bit more, let people in a bit into who I was as a personality and person, other than just the numbers guy. But, the other side of the story is that I don't think anyone doubted that this was a Chancellor Exchequer who was in charge and knew what he was doing and had authority in the government. Remember, lots of chancellors don't have that. And so there was a price to be paid for it, but the result was I was able to do the job, I think.
But quite a lot of the ways in which you demonstrated that charge, the areas where there was a fiscal squeeze or cuts, was aimed at ordinary people. So ending universal child benefit, a benefits cap, cutting Sure Start, changeover into universal credit, which was over time supposed to bring down the benefits bill. I mean, do you look at what's happened since you've left office? You look at the rise in child poverty, you look at some people who are really struggling now, and do you feel culpability or responsibility for any of that?
The short answer is, I think we did the best we could to help those people in a situation where a collapsing economy was going to hurt them most. I'm not claiming we won this argument with the sort of public perception, although we got re-elected 5 years later. But we deliberately skewed the cuts towards the wealthiest. I know people don't believe that, but in fact, all the subsequent studies by people like the Institute for Fiscal Studies have shown that's the case. We increased tax. I get criticized. The thing I get criticized for now in the newspapers is putting up stamp duty on expensive houses, getting rid of the non-dom status. You mentioned child benefit. What did I do? I took child benefit away from the richest 15% of the country. I got more noise on the BBC and Radio 4 and Day Programme and all that about taking money away from the richest 15% than I ever got for squeezing, public sector pay and the like on the lower end. It was the student riots, which were the kind of defining picture of that period, students, overwhelmingly middle class. We were simply saying, if you can afford it, you've got to pay for your university education. Most of you can. Most of you are going to end up in jobs far more better paid than people who don't go to university. And sure enough, all the students went on all right. And they were middle class. They were cuts aimed at the middle class largely. And it was the middle class who complained vociferously about it and wrote their Guardian articles about it. But we did a lot to try and protect people on lower incomes. I know that is not the public perception now, but if you look at the actual data, child poverty went down, inequality went down. And if we had not done those things, the people who are affected by crashes and financial crises are not, frankly, the billionaires and the rich people and people in nice middle-class professional jobs. It is the poorest. They are the people most exposed to the job market. They're the people who get unemployed. And the government I was part of created more jobs than any other government in British history. I grew up in the 1980s, insulated from it, as we've discussed, but in an age of mass unemployment, 3 million people unemployed, large parts of the North and Midlands of England, and indeed in Scotland, with towns where no one worked. And by the time I left office, when I got a chance to be in office, we were close to full employment in the country. And we avoided that scarring unemployment after the financial crash that you saw in places like France and Germany and Italy, not Germany, France and Italy and Spain.
Do you still think that universal credit is the best way to run benefits?
Well, I didn't think it was I was against universal credit at the time. I mean, inside the government, I thought universal credit was not an idea that was going to work. I opposed it. I kept my mouth shut because, we were a team in government and I didn't leak things where I disagreed. But now various memoirs have been published. I can reveal I was against universal credit. I didn't think Ian Duncan Smith's plan would work. And put it this way, I'm yet to be convinced that it will.
So if we look at other big policy pronouncements, one of the things that you really wanted to do was to skew the focus away from just the City of London, and that's where the Northern Powerhouse idea came along. Do you really think the northwest of England can be that counterbalance to a global city like London?
Well, we've talked about, my childhood growing up here in central London, going to school here, and the best thing that happened to me, not that it was planned in any way, was that I became an MP in the north of England. I was just applying for any Conservative seat that would have me. And I ended up being a constituency MP in Cheshire, in a middle-class part of Cheshire, but very close to Manchester. And it really opened my eyes to the rest of the country and to parts of the country which don't look to London. Not just, you know this well in Scotland, but it's true also in the northwest of England. And
we call it that London up there.
Yeah. People around Manchester are not thinking about what's going on in London. And it was... It took me a while because I think the first couple, as Chancellor for 6 years, first 2 or 3 years, I was very focused on the economic rescue plan and everything we've been talking about. And then I began to think, well, look, there's more we can do here. And I don't believe, I'm not one of those Conservatives who thinks there's no role for government or the state shouldn't get involved. Far from it. I think there's a very big role for government. I've always don't understand why people who think there's no role for government go into politics. What's the point? I was in politics because I thought it really mattered what you could do in government. And I thought you could lift up the north of England. You could connect the cities better, create this northern powerhouse, as we dubbed it. And it was a real thing. It wasn't just that the north was, needed a boost. It was, we've got an economic plan for the north to connect these big cities like Manchester and Leeds and Liverpool more closely together and create a mass of people not unlike the size of London. Because these distances are not great. The distance between Manchester and Leeds is the same as the distance on the Central Line in London. But people don't travel between the cities in the way they do here. And in London. So I became really passionate about that. And it was one of those causes I developed later in my chancellorship. And I think one of my biggest regrets, you always know your moment's going to come to an end in politics. And there are lots of projects that inevitably fall with you. And the thing I felt most frustrated with was I felt if I'd had another couple of years, we could have really cemented the idea behind the Northern Powerhouse. And that's why it became the thing I then pursued out of after being Chancellor.
And you talked about in there the transport links being part of that. You were probably the biggest champion for HS2 in government. If you look at some of the costings and things now, do you still think that would transform the kind of country and the economy in the way that you thought it would?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, government spends hundreds of billions of pounds a year, every year, and around £800 billion. And I know it sounds very expensive, and indeed is expensive to build a new railway system at the cost of 50, 60, 70 billion pounds. But that's over 20 years. And you have to ask yourself, what would our forebears do? Our forebears, they built the railways, they built the motorways, they built things like the Channel Tunnel, they built bridges, great bridges across our rivers and stuff. You know, what are we doing? There's always a reason not to build something, right? There's always the railways were bitterly opposed when they were built in the 19th century. The motorways were bitterly opposed. The Treasury, I forced them to get out this study when I was Chancellor. The Treasury thought the M25 was a terrible idea and was against spending money on it. And those big infrastructure projects can totally transform the economic geography of a country. And I think HS2, brings the cities of the Midlands and the North much closer to the economic wealth of London, if you like, the sort of economic powerhouse of London. And as it happens, connects other parts of the country more closely, including Scotland. And you have to ask yourself, how have we ended up as the inventor of the railways being about the only country in the Western world that does not have high-speed trains apart from when you go to the Channel Tunnel? All the resistance to it, when you boil it down, is essentially NIMBYism. It's like, I don't want this in my backyard. And of course, I understand that if it was my backyard, and I understand. But in the end, the national interest is to try and identify what is overwhelmingly in the interest of the whole country rather than a particular group or a particular constituency or whatever. And HS2 went through my Cheshire constituency. I had angry public meetings about it. But in the end, it's definitely the right thing for the country. And were it to be abandoned, it would be a huge betrayal of the north of England. And
you don't see why that NIMBYism exists, because you live at one end of where the track would be, and I'm sure the people at the other end think it's a great idea, but the people whose houses and gardens and roads and town centres is whacking itself through in fields don't get any benefit from it.
Well, they are compensated for it because, of course, it's a very tough break for them, and I'm not pretending it isn't. But in the end, you've got to, part of politics and government is about trying to weigh where is the overwhelming national interest, even if there are particular groups or particular individuals, or in this case, particular village or whatever that is affected. I represented a constituency in Cheshire where Elizabeth Gaskell, the novelist, lived. And in her book, Cranford, which is based on the town of Knutsford in my constituency, the kind of central plot is the town's against the railway coming, right? And when I became the MP for Knutsford, the town was against the railway coming. This time it was HS2. And yes, of course, but if you don't build things, you are failing the next generation. There's no political advantage. HS2 was nothing other than a complete headache for me, right? And I just had people against me, and I was never going to be in office when the thing opened, however quickly it was delivered or however slowly. But it was the right thing, and I have a dream that I will, before I die, get myself on the high-speed train to Manchester, and I will say, because of me, this thing happened. And it was, I do think if I had not driven it through in government, and indeed I first came up with the idea in opposition, it wouldn't have happened. And I think it will change the economic geography of Britain for the better.
You famously operated in that first term as a quad with the Lib Dems and coalition, first coalition in 60 odd years. So it was you and David Cameron and Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander. The pictures of you and Danny Alexander at the cricket together, you came up to Scotland and I was to come over and see you, and I turned up and you were having dinner with them just quietly because you were actually really good friends. It often surprises people outside of politics that it can be easier to be friends with somebody who's not in your tribe than some of the people who are in your tribe, because I'd imagine there's quite a few Tories that, particularly at the moment, you would not be sitting down for dinner with or going to the cricket with.
Well, as it happens, I'm friends with lots of Conservatives who I don't agree with. I get on very well with Mark Francois, who's a good friend of mine, for example, who's one of the hard Brexiteers. I think there's something that is common to all people who go into politics, whether you're Conservative, Labour, Scottish Nationalist, Liberal Democrat, you basically care about your society and think you want to make a difference. You might bitterly disagree about how you do that, and they may be very legitimate, but those differences. But I always was really interested in people in the other tribes and what motivated them and drove them. I have a kind of strange detachment. It was a bit like I was telling you the story of watching Tony Blair get elected in '97, even though I was working in Downing Street for the Tories at the time and being excited about it. I really enjoy talking to people about politics, whatever their background, and trying to understand their motives. I think there's an absolute dead set rule in politics, which is if you cannot understand why people vote for the other team, you are never going to get elected to office. Right? If you don't understand as a Labour politician why people vote Conservative, forget it. You're not going to be in Downing Street. And if you're a Conservative who doesn't understand why people vote Labour, forget it. So I've always had an interest in other political parties and other politicians from those parties. And then, I think we were blessed, David Cameron and I, that we had people as reasonable and sensible and willing to make something work as Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander working with us in that coalition. And it could so easily have been not the case. We could so easily have had people who wanted things to fail. There are politicians who want to leave the room without an agreement. They want to leave the room disagreeing. Those people, Danny and Nick and others, and actually many of the Liberal Democrats wanted it to work.
Now, there's a question that I've never really understood is all of the parties at some point had an in-out European referendum in their manifestos. And at the 2015 election, it was in the Conservative manifesto, but not the Lib Dems. I mean, was there a calculation made that, it'll probably be another coalition, they'll make us take it out anyway, we won't ever really have to do it, and that is a bit of red meat to the rank and file? Or was it a case of, we will have to do it, but it's all right, we'll be up and down and we'll win it at a canter?
Well, I wasn't in favour of having a referendum. I wasn't in favour of it being in our manifesto. And I thought it was going to be very bad for the Conservative Party and we might lose the referendum and it'd be very bad for the country. But I held my tongue. I had the arguments inside and I lost those arguments and held my tongue. I never thought it was realistic we could ditch it if there was going to be another coalition, because David Cameron had, in my view, again, doubling up on the mistake, said, I will not be the Prime Minister unless we have this one policy implemented. So he had really dug in on the referendum, and the whole Conservative Party had dug in on the referendum. It's not just, it's very easy to personalise it against him. But I remember all the Tory MPs, including many who subsequently voted to Remain and who regret the result, enthusiastically voting, on kind of quiet Fridays in Parliament when we didn't have a chance of winning for this referendum. And if you think about why, it's easy, which is we couldn't agree. The one thing everyone could agree on was let someone else decide this European issue. So this is easy. Let the people decide is a simple, easy thing to say. And it's more popular than explaining to people, well, actually, we need to be in the European Union because it's in our interests and whatever.
I get that, but you had first-hand experience in a country that doesn't usually do referendums of having had one up in Scotland about independence. And it was clear in that referendum, really fresh in people's minds before Brexit happened, that when you've got a big constitutional change that's mooted, the people that are proposing that big constitutional change can say almost anything they like about what comes after and what that's going to look like. And it takes time. It takes 18 months in Scotland's case to break down some of those arguments of free unicorns for all. I mean, even on the practicalities of the Brexit case, if you wanted to remain, did you not argue or think, you can't knock these arguments down in 6 months?
Well, the Scottish referendum was different, I think, in a number of ways. First of all, you're the expert more than I am on this. I think the independence referendum was coming, and so because a Scottish nationalist administration had been elected in Holyrood, and so the question was on what terms and on what question, and can we make it decisive? Are we going to have that referendum? Whereas the EU referendum was not coming. If we hadn't decided to have one, there wouldn't have been one. Second, I think we found a much better argument for Scotland remaining in the Union than we found for Britain remaining in the EU. And you're right, I think the ground was better prepared. essentially all politicians, including, on the Labour and Liberal side, had been blaming Brussels for things that, frankly, were British mistakes or British decisions. And so when it came to the referendum on the EU, in the space of about a month, or 2 months, we had to go from saying Brussels is responsible for all these irritating things to we must stay in Brussels. Whereas in Scotland, there was a much longer and a more mature argument about the Union staying together. I do think if we'd lost the Scottish referendum, it would have been much worse for the country. I mean, I'm no fan of Brexit. I think Brexit's bad for Britain. But I think if the UK had split up, and of course it's a potential threat in the future, but if the UK had split up in 2014, that would have been absolutely catastrophic for Scotland and for England and the other parts of the Union. And I think the night of the referendum, the EU referendum, was pretty terrible in Downing Street. But it was not as nerve-wracking as the night of the Scottish referendum. I remember sitting there with David in 10 Downing Street on the night of that Scottish referendum, just praying that the Scottish people would vote to stay in the UK.
Do you ever wish, having seen what happened in 2016 at the Brexit referendum, seen what's happened since, looking to the future of what UK and the world is going to look like, as somebody who never wanted the referendum in the first place, as someone who shredded some of their conservative shredded their reputation within their own party, going out to actually advocate for Remain. Do you ever wish that you dug in the way that, I don't know, Gordon Brown had dug in over joining the euro with his 5 fiscal tests? I mean, you were the Chancellor, you had the Treasury at your disposal. Do you ever wish that you'd done more? I
don't think it would have made any difference. I mean, I have thought about it. I don't think if I'd opposed the referendum or resigned, it would have stopped the referendum happening at all. Because I think, David was absolutely clear it was required, and the Conservative Party had almost largely, was entirely convinced itself. I look back at that referendum campaign. I mean, I threw myself into it. I made a lot of enemies inside the Tory party, making essentially the argument that the country would be poorer if we voted to leave, which we are. I don't regret that. I've sometimes thought, if I'd done it like Theresa May had done, and sort of disappeared and gone to ground, and no one really knew what I thought on it, could I have emerged as the Prime Minister afterwards? And I was, frankly, at the time in a stronger position than she was. But I couldn't have lived with myself. I didn't want to be the Prime Minister presiding over a decision that I profoundly disagreed with a sense that I had somehow contributed to it because I hadn't warned the country. The Chancellor Exchequer in that referendum, I had a chance to shift the dial and explain to people what the cost was going to be. And for all the stuff that's been said about project fear and, the exaggerated claims, frankly, the argument we made was, you leave, the country's going to be poorer. The country is poorer than it would otherwise have been. You could tell that when you go on holiday. The pound is not worth, that's what we're paid. Compared to the rest of the world, we're not as rich as we could otherwise have been. The country isn't performing as well as it should do. We are paying a price. And I am at least, I sleep easy knowing I did do my best to warn people. I deeply regret the referendum. I deeply regret the result. I think the campaign could have been better. There are lots of things we could have done better. But people were told. And by the way, I also went to Newry on the Irish border, first Chancellor Exchequer in over 100 years to go to Newry, and said the Irish border is going to be a massive problem, and the Union of Ireland is, the Union of Northern Ireland in the UK is under threat if we leave. And I think, personally, it's now pretty likely there's going to be a federated, in that sense, united Ireland in my lifetime.
So with you having had a chancellorship that was all about stressing fiscal responsibility, and you sitting here post your time of office saying the country is poorer because of this decision that the Conservative Party, you were part of the cabinet, put to the people in the decision that they took, do you think that there's any shred of fiscal responsibility left that Conservatives in government have?
Well, I'm not against government spending money where it can afford to. I'm not someone who doesn't want there to be a health service or an education service. I'd love to have been able to spend more money on those things, and where I could, I did spend more money on things like HS2 and infrastructure and science and lots of other things. But you've got to live within your means fundamentally, or else what happens is you spend a lot of money now, and then 5 years down the track, you've run out of money and you have to do all these big cuts. And that's, we've already been through that as a country recently. So I would just say, yes, government can spend more on the health service and whatever. We're not in the depths of the crisis we were in 10 years ago. But the money's got to come from somewhere ultimately. And it will catch up with the Tory party if it just goes on making all these spending premises and it can't pay for them and it thinks it can borrow them and leave it to future generations to pay. I also think politically, you can't say to the country, Jeremy Corbyn's got a magic money tree, and then go around planting a whole forest of magic money trees yourself.
I think I spoke to you on the phone the morning of the Brexit referendum result. I spoke to David Cameron. He chose to go immediately. You chose to stay on. And then was sacked by Theresa May when she came in as the successor, and in quite a brutal way, where there was briefings about it that you were told after 30 years of being a full-time employee and then representative that you needed to get to know the party better. That must have rankled, surely.
That's one way of putting it, yeah. Thought I'd go and edit a newspaper and make it clear what I thought about her in return.
Do you think you ever went a bit too far? Because, some of those standard front pages and leaders were brutal, and it was day after day after day.
I worked with Theresa May for 20 years. I was in the room when she was appointed the Shadow Education Secretary many, many years ago. It was my idea, actually, to make her the Home Secretary as part of the Cameron team. And I worked really well with her in government. To be honest, I didn't understand. I totally understood, she might want her own Chancellor Exchequer. I totally understood that there was no space for George Osborne in her government. Those are decisions a Prime Minister has to take, and I've seen that close up, and it can be pretty brutal. And I'm very, I was very aware of the downs as well as the ups of politics. So it wasn't the kind of being fired. It was just the really unpleasant way I was fired. And then her team of advisors briefing against me, and I'd given my life to trying to help Conservatives get into office.
Did you go too far, though?
Well, look, there's certainly things I said in private, which, then came out, which I probably shouldn't have said. But my assessment was she was not up to the job of Prime Minister. And I think that's assessment now broadly shared.
George Osborne, thank you very much.
Thank you.